All right, so, before I get started talking about Equiano, I forgot to give you the bibliography sheets for Burke and Wordsworth and their revolutionary poems. I also have here a bibliography for you on Equiano, which you can see is actually really very long. It covers both of the two sides of this sheet. People have been doing a lot of writing and research on Equiano lately. And we're going to be doing things a little bit differently than I usually do in a class like this with Equiano, and I'll explain why. For the most part, and keep this in mind when you're doing your group presentations, I don't give two shits about autobiography, right? I don't care where the author was born or when he was born. I don't care where he died. I don't care who he was married to. I don't care what he ate for breakfast on a daily basis, right? I do not, by and large, regard a literary text as a product of individual circumstances and individual genius. My approach in this class, since this is a literary history class, is more sort of what's called Marxist historicism. Right? Now, this doesn't mean that I'm trying to turn you all into communists. What it does mean is that what I'm most interested in is how a text reflects economic and historical forces in its particular time period, right? So I'm more concerned with how a text reflects particular ideologies, social practices, economic practices, right? And because Equiano wrote an autobiography, and just by the very nature of who he was, is very much involved in some of the economic and ideological debates in his day, we're going to focus a little bit more on his life than I usually would, right? In part, yeah, his life is what he's writing here. So let's start from this image here. This is the frontispiece of the first edition of the Interesting Narrative. What do you notice about Equiano's self-presentation here? You've had plenty of time now to look at this image, to take it in. What do you notice about his self-presentation? Yeah, he's dressed like an English gentleman, right? His hair is cut in the English fashion. He's wearing a frilly cravat, because why wouldn't you, right? If you had the chance. He's wearing, a very English-style button-up coat. And can you see what he's holding in his hand?
It's the Bible.
Yeah, it's the Bible. And can you tell which book of the Bible it's open to? The Acts of the Apostles, right? Yeah. And there are some Equiano scholars who argue that his thumb is pointing to a specific passage in the Acts of the Apostles.
It's a stretch.
It is a bit of a stretch. It's kind of hard to see there, right? But their argument is that his thumb is pointing to the verse in which one of the apostles converts an Ethiopian, right? I think that, this is probably a better idea than there's evidence for, really, in the picture. But the image that Equiano is giving you here is of an assimilated Englishman, right? He's writing the narrative under his African name, Olaudah Equiano, though he does also give us the European name that was bestowed upon him, Gustavus Vasa, which, by the way, was the name he largely used day to day, right? He used Olaudah Equiano in his persona as an author, but in his private correspondence and in his day-to-day life, he mostly went by Gustavus Vasa. He married an English woman, had 2 daughters, lived out the end of his life in England, right? Lived more of his life in England and the Americans and at sea than he did in Africa. But self-presentation is particularly important to Equiano for a variety of reasons. The main reason being that he was heavily involved in abolitionist circles in England in the late 18th century, and many enemies of his abolitionist friends claimed that they were doing his writing for him, right? That there's no possible way that Equiano himself could have actually written this narrative or the speeches he gave or the letters that he wrote to newspapers or to Parliament. And even abolitionist discourse actually tended to be pretty racist in this period, right? So let me give you some samples of what both pro-slavery and anti-slavery discourse among English people looked like in the 18th century, and then we'll get to Equiano's own narrative, right? On the pro-slavery side, there were several who argued that the conditions of life in Africa were so bad, and the people were so vicious to one another in Africa, that purchasing them on the Gold Coast and selling them into slavery was actually doing them a favor. Even abolitionists, white abolitionists, tended to argue that the slave system, the slave trade, was people of superior culture and civilization taking advantage of poor childlike Africans who couldn't possibly know what was good for them. Yes?
But how would they know that unless they were in Africa and they studied the ways of those people?
Well, that's the thing. By and large, they weren't.
Yeah.
And most slave trading actually took place on the coast. So very few European slave traders ever went into the interior of Africa. Right? Most of the slaves people purchased on the Gold Coast were prisoners of war who had been captured by various West African kings and chieftains, right? And then they were permitted by law to dispose of these prisoners of war however they chose. And often what they did was sell them to European traders. In fact, this weekend, August 18th, marks the 500th anniversary of a particularly shameful event in human history, in which Charles I, the King of Spain, grants one of his cronies a charter to start bringing and selling African slaves directly from Africa to the New World. Now, this doesn't mean that this is when the slave trade started. The Portuguese had been buying African slaves since about the 1440s, right? But they were always then brought to Europe and then sort of distributed out, right? What this did was start moving African slaves directly from Africa to the Caribbean and to the Americas, right? So it's actually really kind of appropriate that we're talking about Equiano right now, given this particular anniversary. Now, is everybody familiar with the idea of the Atlantic Trade Triangle and how that works? Okay, what's the Atlantic Trade Triangle? Somebody tell me what that looked like. Yeah, Jeremy.
It was the system in which they transport slaves from Africa over to Brazil and then in the West Indies and America. And
Yeah.
it makes a triangle going that way.
Yeah, essentially, we'll start in England, right? And in England, right, you have traders who manufactured goods, weapons, and often liquor. And they would take these to trade in Africa for gold, spices, and slaves, and then sail across what was called the Middle Passage, or the Atlantic Passage, to the Americas, where they would trade for raw materials, sugar, cotton, also indigo and rice. In fact, South Carolina in particular produced very fine rice and a good deal of indigo, right? They produced a lot more of that than they did cotton. Cotton actually kind of comes along as a big cash crop a little later. Yeah. And tobacco, yeah. And then they take this back to England, and the cycle starts anew, right? So, one thing that's particularly interesting about Equiano, and one thing that makes him part of a set of really interesting figures in this period, right, is that he is not, or his activities are not those that we would typically associate with slavery in the Americas. He's not a plantation worker. Even though the songs and chants that I was playing for you at the beginning of class, right, those were work chants, right? Now, in his actual profession, Equiano would have used similar chants, right? We use those sorts of chants, or people use those sorts of chants as kinds of work songs to keep up a rhythm while doing various kinds of strenuous, repetitive work, right? Were you able to gather what Equiano actually did, like what his actual profession was?
I don't want to call him a comforting pig or whatever, but he played with the kids a lot, so.
Okay, well, we see him playing with children a lot, but that's not his job, right?
He was like more of a servant on ships and stuff for a captain.
Yeah, exactly. He was a sailor. Yeah, he was a sailor. Lots of sailors on ships that moved along the Atlantic Trade Triangle were enslaved. Now, there was actually a good deal more egalitarianism on a ship than there was on land typically, in large part because everyone's survival depended on working together, right?
I was going to say, if you
Yeah.
piss off your sailors, they'll kill you.
Yeah, if any one person on the ship isn't performing their job, isn't performing their function, then particularly in this era of wooden ships sailing across vast stretches of ocean, there's a good chance everyone's going to die, right? So, sailors tend to form slightly more tight-knit egalitarian communities than was possible between different people of different social conditions on land, right? The other thing that's interesting about sailors in this period, though, of the first 6 autobiographies in English written by black men, all of them were written by sailors. Sailors had a better chance of acquiring, an enslaved sailor had a better chance of acquiring literacy, for one thing, than someone who worked on land in the plantation or was a servant in a house. In part because everybody needed to be able to do most jobs on a ship, and some of those jobs required you to be able to read. And also because of the kind of loosening of social strictures on shipboard. This doesn't necessarily mean that he was treated any better, as we saw, by people who, quote unquote, owned him, right? We still see him subjected to some pretty vile treatments. But he had opportunities for contact with other places and other cultures and with writing that most enslaved people would not have had. Right? And in fact, it's these sailors' networks, right? These networks of black sailors stopping in at various ports, particularly in the New World and in England, making contact with each other, making people on land, that help to spark black abolitionist movements in these places, right? Yes.
At the very beginning of the story, I might just need to read it. I was slightly confused. Was he originally, he started on a plantation when he, before he became a sailor at the beginning.
Mhm.
Was he in the new, was he in America or England at that point?
Well, there's some, okay, as far as his narrative is concerned, he's born in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
He's born in what is now the Igbo province in Nigeria, and is taken from there by black slave traders to the Gold Coast, where he's sold and then carted across to Virginia. So at the beginning of our portion of the narrative here, the excerpt we're looking at, he's in Virginia. There is some dispute among scholars as to where Equiano was actually born. In part because there are documents that exist that say that he was actually born in South Carolina, despite his claims of having been born in Africa. Now, the problem is that all of these documents were produced by people who had a vested interest in maintaining a stake of ownership on him, right? So there's incentive for them to lie about where he was born, right? To show that he was born on their property and thus was their property. So most scholars of Equiano's life and work take his claims of being born in Africa as more or less accurate. Right. Now, as far as his self-presentation is concerned here, again, right? So one of the things that he is attempting to do here is to meet the English on their own ground and to try to allay suspicions that he's not who he says he is and that he's an imposter, right? That he's a puppet for radical abolitionist ideas. Now, one of the ways he and his allies combated this idea was by embarking on what was probably the first successful book tour in English history. Right? So it's normal now, right, for an author who is selling a book to go and give readings in bookstores all across the country, right? I used to work in publicity for a publisher, right? My job was to help set up these tours, call up books, hey, our author is coming to Portland, Oregon on this date, right? Can we set up a reading in the store, right? Can we set up some TV interviews and blah, 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 and all that, right? So Equiano is the guy who really kind of gets all of this started. He has a phenomenally successful book tour. Now, it's as much people coming out to see him because they're curious as actually coming out because they're interested in the book or its contents. But he is at great pains to show, because there are people who would doubt him, that this is his work, this is his story, and he's not going to let anyone tell him that he's a puppet or an imposter, right? In fact, we see that even in the very first line, like the very title of his autobiography, right? Which seems a little bit lengthy and florid maybe to us, but one, that's 18th century style, and two, there are a couple of things that he's trying to do that are very important with this title, right? So, the interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself, right? So that claim of authorship is right there in the title, right? This is my work. This was done by me, right? Nobody else is telling me what to do or what to write. He's also putting his kind of hyphenated identity in the title as well, right? Does he use just one of his names?
He uses both of them.
Yeah. He's Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vasa, right? He is identifying himself as both of these people. Yes, I am Olaudah Equiano, who was born in the Igbo province. I am also Gustavus Vasa, who served on a ship and was renamed this by my previous master, right? All right. So, what did you make of this sort of first bit where he's working in the household in Virginia. Was there anything that struck you about this as weird or interesting, particularly about the objects that are in the place? Yeah, Jeremy.
It's from at that point, viewpoint of a child trying to describe something he's never seen before.
Yeah, he doesn't know what most of these things around him are, right? These are things that his people don't use and don't do. So he's trying to figure out what's going on around him. Yeah, Dejan.
I was gonna ask, wasn't he like afraid that like the clock or something was like watching him or something or monitoring? He was
Yeah.
like I can't remember, but he was scared that it was like making a noise.
Yeah.
And he was like, I don't want it to like be watching me and like, tell it that the master, like you know what I'm saying, something like that.
In fact, does he use the word clock to describe this thing?
Watch.
He uses the word
Exactly.
watch, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. He specifically chooses to call it a watch, right? So he's playing on that ambiguous meaning. Yes, a watch is a timepiece, but to watch is also to keep an eye on somebody, right? So yeah, so there's this feeling of being spied upon, of being watched, being viewed while he's in this room, right? What other objects in the room reinforce that idea?
The pictures.
Yeah. He's never seen a painting like this before, right? All right, bottom of page 99, right? When I immediately after observed a picture hanging in the room, which appeared constantly to look at me, I was still more affrighted, having never seen such things as these before. At one time I thought it was something relative to magic, and not seeing it move, I thought it might be some way the whites had to keep their great men when they died, and offer them libation as we used to do to our friendly spirits. So he's on the one hand, he's trying to assimilate this unfamiliar object to his own experience, right? Okay, like, what thing do I know that is somehow like this? This must be a thing like that. But he's also afraid, like with the watch, right, that the picture is looking at him and is going to do something to him if he steps out of line. Now, what would have given him this impression in this, in this particular house? What else has he seen coming into the house?
The other servant that had that.
Yeah, the woman doing the cooking in the house has been muzzled with some kind of contraption, right? So she is quite literally silenced, right? She is unable to speak.
Or eat.
Or eat, yeah. Yeah. She's unable to use her mouth at all. Which, I'm not sure if you want the person who's cooking your food to be unable to taste it. But, well, that's beside the point, right? The main point is that she is silenced, right? Now, this is part of a broader discourse throughout this narrative, right? Let's look at the talking book episode on page 101, right? It's just a short little paragraph.
Oh yeah. This is,
Can I get somebody to read from I Had Often Seen My Master and Dick? Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
I had often seen my master and Dick employed in reading, and I had a great curiosity to talk to the books, as I thought they did, and so to learn how all things had a beginning. For that purpose I have often taken up a book and have talked to it, and then put my ears to it, when alone in hopes it would answer me. And I have been very much concerned when I found it remained silent.
Okay, so how is he misunderstanding when he first views it the act of reading?
He's thinking
it's like a conversation.
Yeah, he's thinking, that it is, and that it's supposed to be two-way, right? I say something to the book, it says something back.
Make it easier to read.
Yeah, well, and in a lot of ways, right? Good reading is supposed to be that kind of two-way conversation, right? You ask questions of the book while you're reading. You have a little conversation with it. But he's expecting a more kind of literal conversation here, right? He's expecting the book to talk back. He's expecting the European's book to talk back to him, and it doesn't. And does the way he phrases this suggest that even though now he can read, he's quite gotten over this? Look at the tense in that final sentence. I have often taken up a book and have talked to it, and then put my ears to it when alone in hopes it would answer me, and I have been very much concerned when I found it remained silent. So does he make it sound like this is something that he still does?
Yeah.
So in some sense, however assimilated he is in the frontispiece of his book, right, he still feels like the European's book doesn't speak to him. Pardon?
We were saying we didn't see it, like, you know. I took it so little.
I just took it, I read that paragraph and like
I
laughed
thought
to
it was a
myself.
child.
He's trying to talk to books, and then I just moved on.
Yeah, but I mean, he's no longer a child. He's no longer a child when he's writing, right? And so he's now, he's projecting this into the present. This is something that's still going on. So there is supposed to be, I think, something a little bit comic about it, but I think there is also like it's sort of you laugh at first, and then it's like right? Oh, that's actually really.
Deep.
Yeah, it's actually profound and kind of depressing. Yeah. What were you going to say, Jeremy?
Just the, you talk about the ambiguity of language. This is it right here.
Uh-huh.
With it having a double meaning, what you already said, the meaning of him, it not giving him the information that he wants or he's looking for. It provides information, but not what he's searching for.
Yeah.
Goes
Okay.
in with a lot of his other observations. Kind of, he's starting to get a sense of this is all stuff that's not supposed to be for me, or for whites only, in a way.
Yeah, and he notices that the English do not behave towards each other in the way they behave towards him and towards people who look like him, right? For example, he notes that, for one thing, they don't sell each other. And he thinks that good, right? Okay, yes, right? It's good that you guys don't sell each other, well, but then why do you sell us? Right? What right do you have to do that to us? And you may note as well that when he is talking about his stay in the West Indies, when he refers to that Christian master who has recaptured an escaped slave and tortured the man, right? He puts Christian master in italics to emphasize the irony of this. This is someone who purports to be a Christian, as Equiano himself does, right? But that you would do this to another person, to another human being, seems to be at odds with your professed belief system, right? Now, there's another thing that he's doing in chapter 5 here, pages 104 and 105, that are meant to enhance his authority with an English audience. What do you notice at the beginning and the end of this passage?
He quotes Milton.
Yeah, he's quoting the English poet John Milton, right? Now, this is important for a few reasons, right? One, what does it demonstrate about Equiano to an English reader?
He's learned at least in what they read.
Yeah, he's literate. I mean, he must be if he's writing this, right? And he is well-read, right? He is well-versed in English literature, right? He knows not just the Bible, but also the great English poets, right? He was known in his oratory to frequently throw in quotes from Shakespeare. But the other thing it shows, now, he's quoting from Paradise Lost, right? Now, are any of you familiar with the basic plot of Paradise Lost, what Paradise Lost is about? Yeah, Michael.
Well, it's basically depicting Satan's or Lucifer's failed attempt at overthrowing God.
Mm-hmm.
And
yep,
it goes
that's the whole middle of the poem, right?
I'm trying to think. I read it like 2 semesters ago.
And it ends with the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden, right? So essentially what Milton does is he takes a set of about 6 paragraphs in the book of Genesis and extends it out to about 400 pages of blank verse, right? So Paradise Lost is a little bit of a slog. It's very, 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 very long. The critic Samuel Johnson once said that no one ever wished it longer. But the basic point of quoting Milton and quoting Paradise Lost is that 2 of the major figures in Paradise Lost are expelled from a paradise situation, right? On the one hand, like, most of the best lines in the poem are given to Satan, who was expelled from heaven. And at the end of the poem, Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden, right? So, referencing Milton, referencing Paradise Lost, also references Equiano's own expulsion from what he depicts as the idyllic homeland where he was born. Right, so he's using these tropes, these lines from English literature to relate to his own sense of exile and placelessness. Right? Okay, so what questions do you guys have about any of this?
When he said, all right, I think I'm just reading it wrong. He said, in this state of anxiety, I remained till my master awoke. When I was dismissed out of the room to my no small satisfaction. To my no small, oh, never mind. To my no small satisfaction.
What, can you tell me what page you're on?
100 at the top.
Page 100 at the top, okay.
Yeah, but I see what he's saying.
Okay. But you know, you are actually leading us to something really interesting. If you look at the passage just beyond that, right? So he's dismissed from the room. In this place I was called Jacob, but on board the African snow, or the ship that carried him, I was called Michael. And then when he sold further down to Michael Henry Pascal, his name is changed to Gustavus Vasa. So what does this tell us about Equiano's experience? So what that his name keeps changing?
Because they keep changing it, because they own him, he's property to them.
Yeah, every time he changes hands, right, he is renamed, right? You are my thing now, right? You are an object that I own, so I will call you what I want to call you. I don't care what other people called you, I don't care what you prefer to be called, right? The name you were born with. So, when you're being carried over, you're Michael. When you're in Virginia, you're Jacob. And now we're in the ship, you're Gustavus Vasa. And the name Gustavus Vasa is actually also kind of a sick joke on the part of the ship's captain who buys him, right? Because Gustavus Vasa is a famous Swedish rebel who liberated Sweden from the Danes, right? And then became king himself. So the name is intended to be ironic. Naming a slave after a famous rebel. So he has no control over his own name or what people call it. Now,
I have a question.
yeah, go ahead, Alan.
With that, was it Michael Pascal that he like taught him how to read or whatever, and like they actually got to be friends, and then he kind of ditched him out of nowhere? Was that him?
Pascal allows him to learn to read. He learns to read mostly from other sailors. And he serves in wartime on Pascal's ship admirably, and is commended several times for bravery, and is awarded several cash prizes, as was common, which Pascal then takes. because he owns Equiano. Now, Equiano sees these things as the price. Okay, I'm fine, I'll let you have it as the price of my freedom when all this is over, right? And then Pascal turns around, and instead of giving him his freedom or giving him any of the prize money he owes him, right, sells him to someone else and goes away. Right, if we look on page 103, well, actually, let's start on page 102. He's learning from the Christians on board ship the tenets of the religion, right? Many things I have denied myself that he might have them, and when I used to play at marbles or any other game and won a few halfpence or got any little money, which I sometimes did for shaving anyone, I used to buy him a little sugar or tobacco as far as my stock of money would go. He used to say that he and I should never part, and that when our ship was paid off, as I was as free as himself or any other man on board, he would instruct me in his business, by which I might gain a good livelihood. This gave me new life and spirits, and my heart burned within me, while I thought the time long till I obtained my freedom. For though my master had not promised it to me yet, besides the assurances I had received that he had no right to detain me, he always treated me with the greatest kindness, and reposed in me an unbounded confidence. He even paid attention to my morals, and would never suffer me to deceive him or tell lies, of which he used to tell me the consequences, and that if I did so, God would not love me, so that from all this tenderness, I had never once supposed in all my dreams of freedom that he would think of detaining me any longer than I wished. The key portion in this passage, right, is that attitude towards lying, right? If you tell lies, God will not love you, right? If you tell lies, that's a sin. And then immediately following, in pursuance of our orders, we sailed from Portsmouth for the Thames, and arrived at Deptford the 10th of December, where we cast anchor just as it was high water. The ship was up about half an hour when my master ordered the barge to be manned, and all in an instant, without having before given me the least reason to suspect anything of the matter, he forced me into the barge, saying I was going to leave him, but he would take care I should not. I was so struck with the unexpectedness of this proceeding that for some time I did not make a reply, only I made an offer to go for my books and chest of clothes, but he swore I should not move out of his sight, and if I did, he would cut my throat, at the same time taking his hanger. Or the hanger is a sword. I began, however, to collect myself, and plucking up courage, I told him I was free, and he could not by law serve me so. But this only enraged him the more, and he continued to swear, and said he would soon let me know whether he would or not. And at that instant sprung himself into the barge from the ship, with the astonishment and sorrow of all on board. So, not only has he been lying all this time to Equiano about his freedom, right? He's also now pushing him into a boat at sword point with none of his possessions, right? He's forced to leave his books and clothes, the things he owns, that he's purchased himself, on the ship. And now he's taking him off to another ship to be sold. And when he is sold to this other captain, I think it's really, if we think again about that theme of talking in silence that we see with the talking book, that we see with the slave woman wearing the muzzle, right? If we look on the bottom of 103, when I came there, Captain Doran asked me if I knew him. I answered that I did not. Then, said he, you are now my slave. I told him my master could not sell him to me nor to anyone else. Why, said he, did your master not buy you? I confessed he did. But I have served him, said I, many years, and he has taken all my wages and prize money, for I only got 1 6pence during the war. Besides this, I have been baptized, and by the laws of the land no man has a right to sell me. And I added that I had heard a lawyer and others at different times tell my master so. They both then said that those people who told me so were not my friends. But I replied, it was very extraordinary that other people did not know the law as well as they. Upon this, Captain Doran said I talked too much English, and if I did not behave myself well and quiet, he had a method on board to make me. So, what is Doran's complaint about the slave he has just purchased?
He's smarter than you.
Yeah, he's too smart. He speaks too well. He actually seems to kind of know the law, right? And what's the only possible response he can come up with to Equiano's arguments?
Shut up or I'll beat you or something.
Yeah, the threat of violence, right? Much like we saw with that muzzling, right? Ultimately, the only thing that they can do, when there's no moral force behind their arguments, as Equiano has been arguing throughout the narrative, right, and demonstrating throughout the narrative, the only thing left is the threat of violence, right? Coercion through violence. That's exactly how Pascal gets him into the barge in the first place, by threatening to cut his throat. And that's how Doran gets him to comply on board ship, right? You be quiet or I'll make you be quiet. And indeed, when he says the European's talking book doesn't speak to him, right? It's relating to these kinds of experiences where people won't talk or dispute or argue with him. They'll just tell him, yeah, this is the way things are going to be, or I'm going to hurt you, right? All right, so anybody have any other questions or observations about this? Yeah, Kendra.
Going back to the book thing, how you thought books were supposed to talk to him, do you think that had influence on how he wrote his book? Like maybe he wanted to write his books in a way that seemed like they would speak to him, maybe not verbally, obviously, but I feel like that might have affected the way he wrote, because he thought books were supposed to talk to him, and then he went on to write some.
That he is attempting to have a more direct conversation with the reader. And I think the fact that he then embarks on a tour to directly engage with readers would sort of reinforce that idea. It's like, okay, yeah, look, not only is my book supposed to talk with you, right, I'm actually here to talk with you as well. And he was an enormous success with working class white people in the north of England, in the industrial towns. This was at the time that the Industrial Revolution was just getting underway, and people in a lot of those mills, those plants, were also working long hours, right, interminable shifts for low pay under shitty conditions with no real power to change their lot. Right now, they weren't enslaved. And that's actually one thing that I do quickly want to point to, right? He talks sometimes about the kindness of various masters, but also that even when they are kind to him, he desires his freedom. There's a French anthropologist by the name of Claude Meillassoux. I think I've spelled that correctly. And Meillassoux makes a distinction between what he calls the condition and the state of slavery. Right. The condition of slavery refers to the basic physical condition under which the slave is kept, right? So the condition of slavery can be good or bad, right, under a kind master or a cruel master. But what a lot of people ignore when they're talking only about the condition of slavery, right, is the state of slavery, right? The identity that is branded upon you as a slave, right? Basically, whether or not you're treated well or poorly, you're still a slave. You're still not allowed to leave, right? You can't go where you want to. You can't quit your job and look for work elsewhere. You can't complain about your conditions. right? You have no power to improve your lot. So I think that one thing that Equiano wants us to focus on is, again, this state of slavery, right? Even when people are generally nice to him, he still reminds us that he's not free and that they often do not desire his freedom and aren't willing to help him attain it, right? Whatever the condition they keep him in, they still want to keep him in that state of slavery. So his connection with a lot of those northern workers would largely be one more of condition, right? Even if practically they can't, those workers legally would be allowed to leave their jobs and seek work elsewhere, right? Equiano as a slave would not have been allowed to do that. All right, any other questions, comments, observations? Yeah, Barry.
In chapter 5, he's talking about the passages from Paradise Lost.
Yeah.
Footnotes directly say they're depictions of hell.
Uh-huh.
I kind of got out of that was what he saw in the West Indies, that one of the better ways he could describe it was by hell. Because
Yeah.
they were so horrible with things they were doing.
Yeah, the West Indies, and when we talk about the condition of slavery, the West Indies was probably about the worst place to end up. Not only because of the weather and the fairly difficult and brutal nature of sugarcane farming, which was the primary economic activity there, but also because of the noted brutality of the slave system in that region. How many of you are familiar with the zombie legend? Okay, how many of you are familiar with how many of you know what a zombie is generally? Okay, most of you have probably seen The Walking Dead, right? How many of you know that the zombie legend originates in the West Indies? Jeremy knows. Okay. And where it comes from, right, is new slaves being imported from Africa into the West Indies, seeing people who had been broken by the West Indian slave breaking process. They seem to have no free will, right? And so people came to the conclusion, like, these are the walking dead, right? These are basically walking corpses. So that's kind of where the zombie legend originates. But yeah, I think it is particularly telling that he doesn't describe any of the other places he goes to as being like hell. But the West Indies he does, yeah. He focuses here pretty exclusively on the vicious treatment that slaves receive from their masters here.
I think that might be for English readers too.
Yeah, it's like
the English people probably don't really see that kind of thing. They might see slaves being paraded and beaten, put in those muzzles and other stuff, but they haven't seen this kind of level.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, when we think about it, this speaks also to that question of audience, right? I mean, ultimately, who is he writing for?
English.
Yeah, he's writing for white English people, right? By and large, African slaves couldn't read. They weren't allowed to learn to read. Right now, his unusual circumstances being aboard a ship allowed him to obtain literacy. But how many of you have ever read the narrative of Frederick Douglass? Anybody? Okay, a couple of you, right? When Douglass wants to learn to read, right, he has to do it on the sly because it's illegal in Maryland, where he's living, for a slave to learn how to read. So he's trying to reach, a literate English audience, the people whom he feels have the most power to make changes. All right, anything else? Any other questions, comments, complaints?
Do you know how he got out of the West Indies?
Essentially what happened, he was purchased by a Quaker merchant. And while he was working for this Quaker merchant, he was conducting his own business on the side and saving up money. And finally, by the time he was 21 years old, he had saved up enough money to purchase his freedom. from his owner. And there was nothing legally the guy could do about it. Right. Unlike the previous master who had gotten around this problem by withholding his wages from it. And the prize money he earned in battles. All right. So if there is nothing else, next time we're going to be doing Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads. So you're not reading a poem or poems for next time. What you're going to be reading is Wordsworth's essay, or excerpts from Wordsworth's essay on what he feels poetry should be like, what he thinks poetry should do. So you're going to be looking at a work of Romantic era literary theory. So these are the guide questions. Copy them down, photograph them, whatever. Take them with you. And we'll see you on Thursday.